So I was sort of horrified in a way by having, proved the four-dimensional Poincare conjecture into realizing I better learn some math.
Well, that is striking how much you've done that.
Just tried to enjoy the fact that I was a mathematician and had the leisure and freedom to think about almost anything. My Go-plane friend had given me this tip that I should write a letter to a particular professor at Princeton, not just send a generic application. Ralph Fox, the knot theorist, apparently was for many years in charge of the admissions process. And he said, just write a letter to Ralph Fox telling him that you want to be a mathematician and you want to go to graduate school. See what happens. My mother said, okay, this sounds like a good plan. I think it's great if you go to graduate school, but you should send a picture of yourself. And I said, no, this isn't proper. It's not politically correct. It doesn't matter what you look like. They only should be judging you on your intellectual qualities. And she said, I'm your mother. Everything is show business. Put in this picture. And she told me which picture to put in. And it was a picture that a high school buddy had taken of me standing on a little granite needle of rock near North Palisade in the Sierras. Apparently the photograph flutters out and lands on the floor, and Fox picks it up and looks at it, and looks and sees it's an application and says, let's admit this one too.
So Ed Nelson swears this is true.
Right?
He swears this is true. Yeah.
What ended up sort of changing my direction was a semester I spent in 1988 at Harvard in the fall. Witten's work on what we now call topological quantum field theory, TQFT, had just come out in a preprint form. Bott and Taubes were running a seminar that I was in trying to understand Witten's interpretation of the Jones polynomial. And Atiyah was very bothered by this, and he asked Witten at some conference if there was an explanation in terms of gauge field theory for the Jones polynomial. So Atiyah understood gauge field theory enough to think this was probably right. And the story is that actually Witten worked it out that night and changed his lecture. The next day he was supposed to speak, and he talked on this instead. The big message for me from this was that quantum field theory was this enormously powerful machine that in the hands of an expert could elucidate mathematical problems in a field where the expert in quantum field theory had only a cursory knowledge of the field that he was revolutionizing. I was immediately fascinated with the idea that you should try to build a computer that was based on whatever physics Witten was talking about, and then it would be able to solve these marvelously complicated problems.
When did you go up to Microsoft?
I started focusing on computational complexity, quantum mechanics, condensed matter physics. I was interested in all these things and how it related to topology of anyons, so what you might call now quantum topology. And I was a little bit overwhelmed by all these subjects, sort of floating around in my head. And by, very strange, sort of out of the blue coincidence, I was offered this research position at Microsoft.
It was not because they knew you're interested in quantum computing.
Well, no, not really. One of my conditions for accepting the job at Microsoft is that really no one bother me and I'd be able to do my research in quiet. And they honored this stipulation or request so strictly that after about 6 years up there, I felt neglected. I realized that no one knew or cared what I thought,
So Mike, tell us about your early years.
My father's family were Romanian Jews who came to the U.S. Around 1899, 1900. Apparently, Nadezhda, who was my great-grandfather, Nadezhda Freedman, was a bit of a revolutionary, a socialist revolutionary, and he was betrayed in some way and fled the country with his family. That's at least the family story. I don't know if it's true. Part of the family apocrypha also is that when he passed through Ellis Island, he was told by the immigration officer that Nadezhda was a girl's name and that he would be Yankee from then on. And he took this with quite a bit of pride, and he enjoyed being Yankee Freedman thereafter. So he got a job as a theater critic in a Yiddish language newspaper in Manhattan, which did not pay very much money, as you can imagine. So he was basically completely broke, but he became sort of a godfather figure in a way, a fixer in very small things.
This is your grandfather?
Great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather, on your father's side?
Yeah, on my father's side. Yeah, he would get people into college, get them out of jail, get the best doctor. Sometimes he could help powerful people who weren't Jews by subtly reminding them that there might be a Jewish doctor that did not move in their social circles that actually could cure them. And he would put these little deals together, and he had a little black book. And so that was Yankee Freedman. And he had a son, David, who was my grandfather, who became, had sort of a meteoric rise in show business. He wrote for the Ziegfeld Follies, Fanny Bryce, all the radio shows at the time. Very big figure, very gaudy, ostentatious lifestyle, heavily in debt, earning tons of money, but spending more. And he died very suddenly at 36 or 7, when my father, Ben, was not yet 17. And my father had been a child prodigy, actually very much interested in math, particularly what was going on in logic at the time, Gödel's work and the incompleteness theorem. He had been in a seminar as an undergraduate at Columbia University when he was 13, and it was a graduate seminar in Gödel's work, and he had learned this. And
this is when Barclay Rosser and Kleene.
That's right, it was Rosser and Kleene.
They were graduate students at Gödel.
We talked to my dad just 6 months ago about this, and apparently Gödel's graduate students were commuting back and forth from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton to Columbia to sort of spread the word. This is maybe 1934, about Gödel's latest ideas and discoveries, and so they'd come up and give the word at Columbia, and it was a small clique of professors and graduate students, and my father, who's a tiny child.
13, 14, or 15.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
In those days,
yeah. His father wanted him to become a doctor, so he was doing this math sort of under the rug. It was sort of his secret life. And but then his father died in his senior year at Columbia, and he didn't withdraw. He just never went to class again. I know this because in my father's mid-40s, he went back to UCLA to finish his last year of college, and then he eventually got a PhD in logic at UCLA. But he was very nervous about trying to reapply to college with his transcript, which had all Fs for the last semester. So he had basically all A's until it became all Fs.
So he actually entered Columbia when he was 13.
So 13 through 16 was his career there.
What was the role of his mother in getting him into?
My grandmother, Beatrice, was an amazing woman, and actually I got some firsthand experience with her methods because as a child she tried to teach me to play the piano, and she would sit next to me and hold my fingers and move them where they were supposed to go. So she was didactic in the extreme, and it was very hard to swim upstream. If she wanted something done, it happened. And she decided that her children were going to be prodigies. And my father was the eldest, and there was no hope for him, basically. Every year she would argue with the elementary school authority that he needed to skip the next grade. So he basically went through school in half time. I don't think she lost any of these arguments. And then when she was more practiced at the technique, she actually got his younger brother through even faster, and he went to New York City University, NYU, at 12.8, as my uncle proudly told me, 12 years, 8 months. So she was good at making prodigies, and there's a third brother she pushed, but he became a football player, and that took more maturing. He's an incredibly brilliant guy, and he always found it slightly annoyed that his name around the house was Toby the Dope, because he merely graduated college at 16 3/4. High school at 16 3/4, and went to Stanford. Stanford Medical School. He went to Berkeley undergraduate school to play football.
He was a guard.
Yeah, he was a guard. But he was always, in our family, he was always called Toby the Dope, because he was almost 17 when he graduated high school. And he had a brilliant career, and he was sort of one of my heroes growing up, actually, my Uncle Toby, because he became, his specialty became space medicine. He was in the Air Force during the Korean War, and he parlayed that into becoming the chief medical doctor for the astronauts in the Apollo program. So growing up, I knew all the astronauts in the area. These are the guys that trained in the West Coast, like flew out of Edwards Air Force Base, the X-15 pilots and those guys. So, it was an incredible thing to be a high school student and have access to the astronauts. He also sort of segued into sports medicine, from working with all these diminutive jocks, the astronauts, to the full-size jocks. So he was a doctor for the Lakers and the Rams and a lot of the LA-based sports teams in the 60s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah. Colorful family.
Yeah, colorful family. Just like your upbringing, my father was very busy and interacted with all the kids a lot anyway, even the fact that he was busy. But, my mother had more time. She worked at home. She was a writer, but, she was sort of the one who was actually directly in charge of, our upbringing. And I had some problems as a small child. I had rheumatic fever, and it left me with a bit of a speech defect, and I was teased in school and a little uncomfortable, and she decided that I would just be a great artist. This would be my forte, and a little bit like Grandmother B. When my mother decided something, it was also pretty hard to reverse the course. So I actually did do a lot of painting when I was a child, and I had the feeling that it was my own style that I had developed and invented, but then I realized later on that I was merely reflecting what was considered to be the right way to do art in the 1950s, which was abstract expressionism. But I had sort of learned more or less to make things that looked like Kukushka roughly. So my mother, when I went to college, which was in Berkeley, thought I should be an artist, and again, it's very hard to argue. And I went up to Berkeley on my first day with 2 heavy suitcases filled with my artwork, packed with towels and sheets and blankets, whatever clothing, as padding so the frames wouldn't break, the glass wouldn't crack. So I had these 2 heavy suitcases, maybe 50, I was strong, 50 pounds each, 45 pounds, with the instruction I should find the chairman of the art department and discuss my future with him. So I arrive on Berkeley campus, nearly unable to move with these extraordinarily heavy suitcases, asking directions, and finally get to the chairman's office, which is up some stairs and elevators, and he's not in. But he has a secretary who helpfully says that if I like, I can leave the paintings with her and she'll lock them in the office and I can come back on Monday. So I have only a moment to think. It's like 4:45, and I say, okay, I'll leave them. When I'm outside the building, I realize that all my clothing and bedding, towels, whatever, are in those suitcases, and I go to where I pick up the key for the apartment I'm going to be living in. It wasn't a dorm, it was an apartment, and I let myself in, and the place is completely vacant. there's not a shred of bedding, and I have no way even to stay warm for the weekend.
So what did the chair of the art department say when he finally?
Well, he was, of course, didn't know what to think. I mean, he was an administrator, really. I mean, he didn't even really think of himself as an artist. He was just some kind of person who lectured about art. And, here was this young kid who thought he was an artist. And it wasn't clear exactly what I wanted. Like, did I want to not have to take the elementary classes, like not have to draw pictures of live models because I knew how to do that? What I learned from it was that I would study math.
He did his job correctly.
He did his job correctly. But, actually I had trouble with the language, just as my nemesis was French, not German. That nearly brought me down in my freshman year because I could not understand the sounds coming through the headphones in language lab. And it's really the only thing in my entire life that's traumatized me. I've had unpleasant and dangerous situations, but language lab is the only thing that would make me start awake at night in a cold sweat. And the problem is that the French really don't know how to pronounce their language. They leave off the last 3, 4, 5 letters, right? And they never pause.
So what courses did you take when you were in that 1 year at Berkeley?
Well, yeah, I took a smattering of things. The funny thing is...
Actually, what did you know when you entered Berkeley?
We see, it was also this strange smattering. I'd been trained in part of this child prodigy thing as a youngster, but it wasn't complete. There had been sort of a regression to the mean since my grandmother was fully in charge. So I only had the attitude of a prodigy without the knowledge. So certain subjects I turned my nose up at because I thought they were too routine, like calculus. I kind of got the drift, and I saw, okay, you can do a lot of different substitutions, change the variables, whatever. I don't really need to actually know how to do this. I know in principle how to do it, but I understand what Newton's idea was, and how he figured out that the moon was going around the Earth because of the same force that made the apple fall. All that was perfectly clear to me, but to actually, solve problems. So I didn't know how to do a lot of calculations, but I did know some logic from talking to my father, and I knew set theory. I understood, why everything that they told you about set theory in elementary courses was wrong. It made me feel very superior. So I didn't want to take calculus because I felt I already knew as much about that as I needed. And I didn't take differential equations because that would have required calculus. So I did take a course in linear algebra, and that made sense. But I didn't do great in it. I think I got a B because I didn't really do the exercises. I just got the general idea, subspaces. It's pretty clear. And then I took a graduate course in algebraic topology, and I took a graduate course in set theory, and a graduate course in measure theory.
Did you have any trouble getting into these graduate courses? After all, you were a freshman.
Actually, there was a visiting teacher at Berkeley, maybe you called him a lecturer in those days, Mendez France. Yeah. He was the...
he was related.
Yeah, he was the son of the French, or nephew or something, of the French prime minister. Yeah. And so I took an undergraduate course that he was teaching in set theory, and he was impressed that I knew a lot of stuff about that narrow subject. So then he wrote some letters for me, and then I was able to get into the topology and the measure theory course. So I felt like, but you'll notice those are subjects that you can learn without knowing analysis.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't play chess so much, but I was fascinated by Go. And there was a Princeton, a guy who had come from Princeton, a postdoc in the astronomy department, who we played Go regularly, and while we were playing, I would complain about French, and he knew I was interested in math, and he said, why don't you go to graduate school in Princeton and just forget, all this stuff you're doing in Berkeley. You won't have to worry about languages because they don't really pay attention. Nominally, you have to learn 2 languages, but really all you have to do is like translate 2 papers, and you take a dictionary and you can figure it out. So, he sort of opened my eyes to this possibility, which would not have occurred to me, and I did apply and miraculously got into Princeton with about a year of undergraduate school. My Go-Plane friend had given me this tip that I should write a letter to a particular professor at Princeton, not just send a generic application. Ralph Fox, the knot theorist, apparently was for many years in charge of the admissions process. And he said, just write a letter to Ralph Fox telling him that you want to be a mathematician and you want to go to graduate school. See what happens. So I went to the library and I found his book, Fox and Crowell, and I read the book like over the weekend. And I think in that book he doesn't mention links, just knots. It's interesting. And I got the idea reading the book that there should be an analogous theory for knots of more than one component. And I didn't even know what to call them. I had never heard of the word link. So I wrote this long letter by hand, and I called them linkages. And I said, dear Professor Fox, I read your book. I think it's very interesting, but I've noticed that many of your methods can be applied to linkages of many components. So I discussed the Alexander polynomial as he explained it, and said how you could do it for 2, many components, and how you could do the Vertinger presentation, how all the things in the book would work. So I explained that. And then at the end, I decided, well, I'll just throw in one grand conjecture, because I knew mathematicians conjectured things. So now you have to excuse me because I was below drinking age, so I never had a can of beer with Ballantine ale. So the logo there is these 3 circles that interlace in such a way that it's called the Borromean ring, so that no 2 are connected, but all 3 are connected together. Well, even though I had thought over the weekend about linkages, I hadn't come up with this example. So my conjecture was that it didn't exist. I ended the letter saying, I'm pretty sure if you have a linkage and any 2 of the pieces can be pulled apart without regard to the others, then the whole thing pulls apart. So that was my letter to Ralph Fox. And my mother said, okay, this sounds like a good plan. I think it's great if you go to graduate school, but you should send a picture of yourself. And I said, no, this isn't proper. It's not politically correct. It doesn't matter what you look like. They only should be judging you on your intellectual qualities. And she said, I'm your mother. Everything is show business. Put in this picture. And she told me which picture to put in. And it was a picture that a high school buddy had taken of me standing on a little granite needle of rock near North Palisade in the Sierras. I'm standing on this needle of rock with a gold line rope coiled around my shoulder, which shows that I didn't uncoil the rope to get on top of the needle. I just had that rope in case something worse came along. So this was the picture. And so the story that I heard later through Ed Nelson, is that the letter arrives and it's late. It's after the usual admissions process.
It's a letter with the application?
The application is a letter. I didn't fill out an application.
I see.
But it's, it had my essay on knot theory, so it was a manila envelope with a lot of pages, and the last page on top was the full 8x11 photograph of me on top of this piece of granite. And the story is that they're meeting again, not to admit students, but to decide fellowship support and things like that. It's a late meeting. And the secretary brings in the envelope, and Ralph Fox rips it open.
Actually, I think Ed Nelson brings it in.
Apparently, the photograph flutters out and lands on the floor, and Fox picks it up and looks at it, and looks and sees it's an application and says, let's admit this one too. So he never read the handwritten letter.
So Ed Nelson swears this is true. He swears this is true. Yeah. You left Berkeley after 1 year and you went off to Princeton, and what happened next?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarity in our stories because I was also obviously a bit underprepared. In fact, I remember the drive from Berkeley to Princeton. I decided I better study finally. And I had some books in the passenger seat next to me. I was driving a 1959 VW microbus. And it could actually only go 59 on the flats. So driving through Wyoming, for example, there was really no problem reading a little bit on the side.
Probably safer than texting.
Probably safer than texting. And, I had taken linear algebra, so I think I started by reviewing that. And I remember memorizing the axioms of field because I thought when I got to graduate school I'd need to know this. And there were 9 axioms, at least in the formulation that I was reading. And I remember particularly being puzzled over the axiom 1 does not equal 0, but I filed it away in case when I got to graduate school anyone asked me about that particular axiom.
Were you reading Hoffman and Kunze?
Probably, yeah. And I mean, I was familiar with the book. I don't remember if that was the one on the passenger seat. But, and then of course vector space was just a tuple of elements from a field. That was all right. And when I wandered into my first class at Princeton, it was D.C. Spencer talking about differential equations, PDEs, and he said, let S be the sheaf of germs of sections of a vector bundle. And I thought, well, good, I know what a vector is. I'll learn about this sheaf and germs later. And I mostly learned from students, actually. Perhaps in a similar way to you, there was a fellow, Andy Samizi, yeah, that's right, Andy Samizi. And we talked a lot about point set topology, which I had studied, and he showed me what a vector bundle was in just a moment. A couple charts and change of coordinates looked fine, and sheaf, germ, no problem. So I felt I was off and running. I did, though, turn out to be a little bit of a liability on Fox's account because when they realized I didn't know that much, then I sort of had to be a Fox student. So I was sort of in the repertoire group, but that worked out all right. He, just suggested I think about something simple, that I could understand. And I remember learning about these 2 complexes that are not collapsible, but nevertheless contractible. Like
House with 2 rooms?
Yeah, that's one of them. There's some kind of dunce hat picture, and I studied those a little bit, and I wrote some little paper which never saw the light of day about various types of these things. I was interested in the question of whether the identity map could be deformed so it was not onto immediately, or whether it took some motion before the identity map could be made to not cover the entire space. So anyway, I worked through some things like that, which required me to picture a lot of things, and I thought maybe laid some good groundwork. But then I kind of got the drift. I went to the T's, like had been recommended to you, and all this sort of competitive jockeying to figure out how to approach a problem and to recall a definition. And I kind of got into that game and found out I wasn't so bad at it. So then I sort of got promoted from being a Fox apprentice to a Browder student. And I went to work on Foliations, which was a big topic in those days. I guess codimension...
Going back, you entered graduate school in 69 or 68?
69, yeah, June of 69.
So this is then, when you got interested in Foliations, it's probably the beginning of your second year, or still your first?
Well, no, it wouldn't have been my first year. It would probably been in the middle of my second year. I think John Wood came to the Institute for Advanced Study in my second year. I met him there. I don't know if it was my second or third year, but he had done work in Foliations. I remember he was, in fact, it wasn't the Institute. I think he was actually a professor, assistant professor at Princeton.
Yeah, Bott had done work on Foliations around 1970, 69, yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I attended this summer school that Bott was partially running in Mexico City, I think summer of 1970. Yeah, so I guess I was already interested and knew something about foliations then. And that was a very nice geometric playground. Of course, very quickly Thurston solved most of the outstanding problems at the time.
Right, but he was a little later.
Yeah,
So yeah.
One of the great good fortunes I had in graduate school was that the thesis that I first wrote, I was in this kind of precocious mode, and I wasn't troubled by the fact that I didn't know large swaths of mathematics that might be relevant and useful. So I actually had written a PhD thesis by the end of my third year on foliations.
What happened to it?
Well, it turned out that a Japanese mathematician, Matsumoto, had proved the same theorem. It was a question of constructing foliations. I guess at that point, codimension 1 foliations had been found on every odd-dimensional sphere. And the next sort of frontier was maybe manifolds that were connected up to the middle dimension. And I think what I had done is found foliations on all high-dimensional manifolds connected up to the middle dimension by some small modification of processes that were known for foliating spheres. And I'd written this up, and that was to be my thesis, and I was supposed to graduate, but then we saw this paper, this preprint appear, doing the same thing.
Yukio Matsumoto?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So I had a conference with Browder about this, and he said, well, technically it's all right that it's you've kind of been beaten to the punch, that it was your independent work and it's publishable and publishable level. So he says technically you could graduate, but my recommendation would be just to do something different now. And that was actually the best decision I ever made, or maybe Browder made it for me, because it was that fourth year of graduate school when things started to make sense. It was like, instead of being in a lecture and understanding 10%, I all of a sudden understood 90%, just sort of a phase transition. So it was a great year. I wrote some other thesis, not connected directly to foliations, about representing cycles in codimension 2 homology classes by sort of simplest possible submanifolds. Sort of a high-dimensional generalization of this Tom problem of surfaces representing multiples of the generator in CP2. And then I came to Berkeley. Let me pick up with your question about these notes that you brought back from IHES.
IHES, yeah. I was there in spring '74, so I would have brought it back. You would have seen it in, I spent the summer of '74 in Warwick, so I don't know just when I handed them to you. It might have been September '75.
Oh, all right. I had taken my first job in Berkeley. I was a lecturer 73 through 75, and this was a tumultuous time for me in that in 73 I got married, had my first child, and my first job. So I was really snowed under, I felt, and I was like your dad teaching those 4 classes, and but then I guess Rob came back with these notes. It was probably a year after I had started. But I was still sort of in crisis mode. Not that I had been in continuously, but I remember my son Ben had this terrible earache and had trouble with tubes in his ears. And anyway, so I couldn't hear Rob's lectures on these notes, and I just got the notes. And I found them fascinating. They described Casson's work on an infinite process to produce something which should sort of work in lieu of being able to find 2 handles in topological 4 manifolds, or in smooth 4 manifolds for that matter. And these were called Casson handles. So I didn't have the benefit of the oral explanation, I just had the notes, and I misunderstood them to a certain extent. And it really took about 2 years for me to understand those notes, reading them on and off as I traveled around but I became very hooked on them. And I discovered, talking to Andrew later, that what I did in order to understand his notes was a lot of reverse engineering, that I developed a very elementary geometric understanding of the construction. And this is apparently the very first thing that occurred to Andrew right out of the box. But when he came to write the notes, he thought, well, let's make this a little more professional and discuss spin structures and other algebraic accoutrements. These were sort of icings on the cake just to make the whole exposition elegant. And I spent 2 years sort of scraping them off to get a pure geometric picture of the construction in terms of, what in those days we were calling link diagrams and Kirby calculus. So I worked through these notes on and off, and it was sort of a avocation. I didn't really expect to do very much with them, and I kept working on other problems which had a more predictable horizon, problems I thought I could solve in a year. But I would spend about half my time thinking about these Casson handles. And I started talking to Bob Edwards at some point. I was trying to gain sort of further and further geometric control of Casson's construction. Casson's construction has stages in it, and at some point I realized that it was possible to make the successive stages become geometrically smaller, their diameters become smaller, so that instead of getting some kind of crazy non-compact limit, which was Casson's construction, you could control the limit, and you could get some three-dimensional sort of shell which described the frontier of the infinite construction. I was just beginning to understand what these shells looked like when there was a lucky lecture that I heard. We had these Southern California topology seminars, and I don't remember what lectures were given at the time, but at the dinner afterwards, Bob Edwards took out a napkin and a pen, and he started telling us about this Andrews-Rubin continuum and how to shrink it. And I'd never heard about shrinking. This is Bing topology. It's basically a subject of trying to determine when a continuous map between two spaces is approximable by a homeomorphism. When you can take a map and somehow perturb it and make it one-to-one. That's the fundamental question. And thinking about this issue had led to the discovery in the previous 10 or 15 years of very strange phenomena, manifold factors, metric spaces that were not manifolds, but when you cross with R became manifolds. And this is intimately tied up with these shrinking problems. So it turned out when I looked at the frontier of this kind of controlled Casson handle, I saw basically what was on Bob's napkin, that it was some elaborated version with Cantor set parameters and all this kind of stuff, but it was basically this Andrews-Rubin shrinking problem. So it made me think that this was sort of the right track, that gaining geometric control over these over Casson's construction was leading to limits which looked like things that other people had analyzed. I think this was April of 1981. In your account, things moved pretty fast. So in order to analyze four-dimensional manifolds, given everything that was known about surgery up to that point, and given Andrew's start, which was these Casson handles, even though it wasn't so clear to me at the time, it turns out in retrospect all that was needed to understand topological manifolds was to figure out that Casson handles were homeomorphic to standard handles. It was a very discrete problem. Constructing the homeomorphism is a bit of a trick. There's a lot to do to build that homeomorphism, but the first step is to sort of make contact with these shrinking arguments. And in fact, you end up making contact with a lot of the most interesting work in geometric topology from the preceding decade. We already mentioned Morton Brown's theorem. you need a variant on that theorem at some point. There's a lot of really interesting material involving Brown's ideas and Bing's ideas and Andrews Rubin, sorry. There's a lot of material from sort of this exotic subject within topology, which is sometimes called wild topology, that had been developed in the 50s and 60s. That was, just right. And I wasn't an expert on any of these things, and I was very grateful for the tutelage of Bob Edwards and the advice of Frank Quinn, who had served as, to some extent, a surrogate thesis advisor when I was at Princeton. As you might have gathered from my earlier remarks about Bill Browder, I was a bit in awe of him, and it was much easier for me to talk to Frank, who I found much less intimidating, even though he was comparably knowledgeable. So there was this very exciting spring and early summer. I think I would have just run up to UCLA and worked the whole thing out with Bob if he had been there, but he was in Cambridge that year. He was traveling, and we didn't have email in those days, so I was really cut off from sort of the fount of knowledge.
All summer of '81 he was in Cambridge.
Yeah, so I sort of had to work more or less by myself with long-distance advice from Bob. And at the end, basically what I had is a fairly complete sketch of the proof with a missing module, which is a very technical ingredient about how to actually shrink a certain decomposition, which is, I think in my paper it's chapter 7, which is the Edwards shrink, So I turned that over to the expert, and he shrank it. This is sort of the story of how the Casson handles became homeomorphic to handles, and basically what this allowed was the machinery which Rob and others had developed in the preceding decade to now be applied in 4 dimensions. So that sort of mystery dimension became clarified, at least in the topological category. And I should say as an aside, it's still the most interesting single dimension in topology, but now it's the smooth category that people wonder about. Seiberg-Witten invariance and Donaldson invariance, that whole game. And some lower dimensional echo in terms of floor homology.
Before this September '81 announcement, or August '81, I remember talking to Bob Edwards, and he would tell me what you had done. There was an advance, and I thought to myself, and I think Bob thought to himself, well, this is really nice, this chunk of work, but it's future. Where's that going to go? You're not going to be able to take that any further. And so neither one of us, jumped on the bandwagon. You had a first chunk which appeared as a paper in the Annals.
Yeah.
That was earlier. And then Bob would tell me about the next chunk. And we would figuratively shake our heads and say, it's not worth that looks so improbable that it's going to go further that we're not going to spend time on it. I was there at this conference. It was a CBMS conference where Dennis Sullivan was speaking.
Yeah.
And so Mike, towards the end of the conference, maybe the last day or next to the last day, gets up and announces this result. And I remember thinking to myself, I didn't understand that much of the lecture just at that point, but thinking to myself, if he's right, how in the world does he know he's right? How did he ever get the nerve to make this announcement? Because he can't be positive about this crazy argument. You've got this space you're trying to understand, and you sent cobwebs out through it. Through the re-embedding theorem, you set some trouble like this, and then you investigated some of it, and then there's all the rest of it, which you just crushed to points. Well, how can that work? But it did. After you announced it, then I had to go. Linda was with me, and we were heading for the Sierra, so I left. But Bob Edwards and Rick Ansell and Larry Siebenman, Jim Cannon, they all stayed around for a week or two.
All those guys helped me tremendously. In fact, Cannon sort of clarified and reworked some of the arguments related to the extension of Brown's work that are in my paper. A lot of that is an echo of his thinking.
Right. And Rick Ansell wrote down a shrinking argument. Well, the right people said, it's okay, it works. In that 2-week period, not only you, but the crucial people in the community.
Well, I remember Bob Edwards told me that he had got a call from Bill Browder. Bill Browder had heard about this, and Bill didn't call me, he called Edwards. Edwards was actually offered a job at Princeton at one point.
Really?
Well, or I don't know if it got that far, but Bill Browder wanted to bring him to Princeton. And he said he thought this geometric topology, this wild topology, was worth being represented at Princeton, but that he thought that Edwards was the only person in the subject that had his head screwed on right. That's the quote. So I was among the ones whose head was not quite screwed on right. So when Browder wanted to know if this was really so, he called Bob. And he asked Bob if it was right, and Bob said he thought so. And Browder said, "Are you willing to take the electric chair test?"
Well, I'll embarrass Mike by saying that, I've written in letters that his work in topological form manifolds was the single best piece of mathematics that I was aware of, bar none. Now, I'm not aware of that many, but that's a proviso. But I thought it was really remarkable. If you think of work done for Fields medals, I would guess that if you hadn't done this, it might still be open 31 years later. Whereas as far as I know, that's certainly not true of hardly any other Fields medals work. I mean, Smale's H-cobordism theorem is important and beautiful as it is. That was kind of in the air. Wallace was working on it. Would have happened some years later, I think. The Atiyah-Singer index theorem, I think, couldn't have been. It would have fallen to somebody within 5 or 10 years. But I don't think anybody was even approaching what you were doing. And as we recounted, Edwards and I both thought that this was too improbable. Each of your steps, this is not worth our time to try to. It's so unlikely, and yet it happened. Well, we're mentioning Bob Edwards. So in the mid-'70s, when you were talking to him, he proves a double suspension conjecture, one of Milner's list, and some other stuff. He was really doing really great work in those days.
Well, Bob had this famous fine-tooth comb. Nothing in the subject was considered checked until Bob said it was checked. Many people asked me, why Casson didn't just analyze his own Casson handles. The economic term opportunity costs is the correct answer. Casson made the initial construction. It looked improbable to kind of fiddle with it for 7 years and shake something more out. And he was doing very important stuff. He was finding new invariants to slice knots, and so he had a full agenda. But I had less to do.
There's another story about Edwards. I guess you and I are not really part of it, but the Veblen Prize to be given in '76 was so the committee for it was Chern, Milner, and myself. I had won it in '71, and the other two were obvious choices. And so I thought that Bob Edwards for the double suspension conjecture was a natural person. Milner thought Thurston was, obviously, and Chern was in favor of Simons. And so we discussed this a bit, and unfortunately we didn't even consider 3 of them. 2 seemed like plenty. And I didn't know much about Jim Simons' work because I wasn't a geometer, but Chern was I was not going to talk Chern and Milner out of what they thought should happen, so Edwards didn't get it. But I thought that he deserved it. I mean, maybe not then, or somehow he deserved it, but he never did. But he did get an hour's talk at the Helsinki Congress out of that, which is something. But he was a fine mathematician. You were at Berkeley for 2 years as a lecturer, and Berkeley did not really seriously consider keeping you on. I remember thinking you were a little lucky to get a job at UC San Diego, because you hadn't done that much. We didn't realize how smart you were, or didn't realize what your future was going to be like. So you go off to San Diego, and then it's another 4 or 5 years to 1981, and you do this marvelous piece of work. And then my impression is you decided, or somehow you became somebody who knew a huge amount of mathematics, unlike the previous half of your life when you, as you've been describing, didn't know much mathematics. You didn't know calculus.
I picked up a little calculus because I did have to teach it, but no, but actually I was sort of horrified in a way by having proved the four-dimensional Poincare conjecture into realizing I better learn some math.
Well, that is striking how much you've done that.
I really embarked on a sort of a program of self-education after that work was done, and just tried to enjoy the fact that I was a mathematician and had the leisure and freedom to think about almost anything. It'd be a shame to waste that. In retrospect, there's some value in having a plan. In academia, and particularly in math, I think we often just think about the thing that comes easiest to us, what's in front of us, but we don't think of long-term goals for ourselves, and it's typically outside the mathematical culture. It's very interesting if you work in industry. Every year, every 6 months, people ask you, well, what is it you're trying to achieve? It's it's not actually such a stupid question as it sounds. So I think I probably would have benefited in the early '80s, from that question. Like, what should you really try to do? I think I did interesting things, but I basically worked mostly with my students, as you did, on sort of whatever came up in seminar that fascinated us. I did a little bit in dynamics with the student John He, and some more topological form manifolds with Zhenghan Wang and Slava Krushkal. So there were many students and many interesting collaborations, but I think what ended up sort of changing my direction was a semester I spent in 1988 at Harvard in the fall. Witten's work on what we now call topological quantum field theory, TQFT, had just come out in a preprint form. This was, again, pre-internet. So we had like a mimeographed copy or something like that of a Witten manuscript at Harvard, and Bott and Taubes were running a seminar that I was in, trying to understand his interpretation, Witten's interpretation of the Jones polynomial. So this is, this famous work of von Jones, which even in Vaughn's mind, definitely had a connection to physics, but it was more statistical physics, and it was still sort of in a quasi-two-dimensional sense, where you were thinking more about the knot diagram in the plane than the knot itself in 3-space. And Atiyah was very bothered by this, and he asked Witten at some conference if there was an explanation in terms of gauge field theory for the Jones polynomial. So Atiyah understood gauge field theory enough to think this was probably right. And the story is that actually Witten worked it out that night and changed his lecture. The next day he was supposed to speak, and he talked on this instead. Witten is a rather amazing figure. And so this paper arrives at Harvard, and we're supposed to be skeptical, and I was very skeptical. I'd never heard of this Witten guy. And the first thing I noticed was that there seemed to be something missing in his understanding of 3 manifolds, because he kept saying something about a knot giving rise to or a link giving rise to a 3 manifold, and there was no mention of a framing, which you need to describe the surgery. So I just thought, well, this thing sounds very improbable from the start, all this infrared, ultraviolet, what could that be about, and no framing on the link. So I thought this can't be any good, and we sent off a letter to Witten asking about the missing framing. And as soon as the mail could go in both directions, we got the answer. He just said, "Oh, I apologize for leaving this out. It'll be in my next version. This is what we in physics call a point-splitting regularization, and of course it's necessary to make the expectation values of the Wilson loops well-defined. So it wasn't, it was no big deal. And then everything else was, of course, perfectly correct. So, the big message for me from this was that quantum field theory was this enormously powerful machine that in the hands of an expert could elucidate mathematical problems in a field where the expert in quantum field theory had only a cursory knowledge of the field that he was revolutionizing. So now when I hear that Witten is doing geometric Langland's program, I don't ask myself, well, does he really understand all the representation and number theory involved? And I know that he doesn't need to, that, with quantum field theory, he can kind of steamroller, many of these subtleties. So that was half the seminar. The other half of this turning point for me is I was, at that time, quite interested in computational complexity, sort of theoretical computer science, sort of an echo of my early logic training, I think. And in those days, the circle of problems that were included into difficult complexity classes, such as NP or sharp P, was constantly being expanded. And one of the recent expansions was the exact value of the Jones polynomial, expressed as an algebraic integer at some root of unity, was just shown by Welsh and Jaeger to be sharp P complete, which is a very hard complexity status. So, here in one seminar we were reading that the Jones polynomial is some bit of physics, and its expectation values is apparently a physical notion. On the other hand, we're learning that if you could measure these values, you'd have solved an extraordinarily difficult class of computational problem believed to be outside the ken of any computer. So immediately I thought, well, this contradicts the Church-Turing thesis, that there's only one kind of computer up to polynomial equivalence. So I was immediately fascinated with the idea that you should try to build a computer that was based on whatever physics Witten was talking about, and then it would be able to solve these marvelously complicated problems. Well, there were several things wrong with my understanding. One is I had no idea about the notion of what in physics is called effective field theory. So since Witten's gauge group was SU2, I thought we needed a physical system that was had SU2 symmetry. So I looked up, physics. I looked up the standard model, and SU2 is associated with the weak force. So I thought, okay, we need, we need beta decay or something. We need nuclear reactors, to build this computer. It's not going to be solid state because electromagnetism is U1. That's not enough for a non-abelian gauge theory. Well, of course, so that turned out to be completely wrong, because in condensed matter, even though the fundamental forces are U1, you can have effective low energy descriptions of a system which involve non-abelian gauge fields. But that idea actually didn't emerge till about 1990, so it was a little, I wouldn't have been able to easily find an expert. I think there was one person, Greg Moore. If I had known that he knew that and had his phone number, I probably could have found out in '88. The other area where I was kind of going off half-cocked is I didn't realize at that time that there's a big difference between the exact value of the Jones polynomial, being sharp B hard, and what you could ever hope to measure about the state of the physical system by quantum mechanical measurement. Because quantum mechanical measurement is a statistical process, probabilistic, so that the exact coordinates of the state vector are lost when you measure. You just get some shadow of of the vector statistically in one eigenstate or another. But it turns out that, again, I was lucky. My misconception was not serious. It turns out that many of the problems which are sharply hard to compute exactly are still outside of P, polynomial time, to compute even very approximately. So that little roughness also historically turned out to be fine. But it was a very slow start to this because there was a lot to be developed in physics and a lot for me to learn. lot to be developed in computer science, and there was really almost a 10-year hiatus. It wasn't until the late 90s that I got back to, I really sort of started to understand how the physics that Witten was describing in his paper was related to things that experimentalists were doing in the laboratory, like quantum Hall effect.
So this brings you to the late 10 years from 88 to 90.
Yeah, like 97 or something. Yeah.
I have to say that I was at Harvard in that same fall semester visiting, and in my usual inimitable fashion, I probably went to that seminar a couple of times and didn't listen.
See, it changed my life, that seminar.
When did you go up to Microsoft?
I started focusing on computational complexity, quantum mechanics, condensed matter physics. I was interested in all these things and how it related to topology of anyons, so what you might call now quantum topology. And I was a little bit overwhelmed by all these subjects, sort of floating around in my head. And by, a very strange, sort of out of the blue coincidence, I was offered this research position at Microsoft.
It was not because they knew you were interested in quantum computing.
Well, no, not really. And then I took the offer basically because I didn't see how at a university I could hope to train graduate students in a subject that I didn't understand at all myself. I mean, I was a little worried about that. So it was very attractive to just go somewhere and think. There were some students from San Diego, Stephen Altshuler. They were students of Richard Hamilton, but they had been in my topology seminar. And after graduate school, they had gone to work at Microsoft Research. And I got a call from Steve inviting me just to come up there and give a talk because they have essentially an academic environment, and I accepted and I gave my usual math talk. But then I was offered a job to my startlement. And I said, well, don't you have to put a file together and ask the dean and things like that? And Nathan Myhrvold, who is the chief technology officer, said, no, I'm the boss. I think what you're talking about is interesting, and we need some interesting scientists up here, so why don't you come work for us?
Then after a while, you started up Station Q here. How did that happen?
One of my conditions for accepting the job at Microsoft is that really no one bother me and I'd be able to do my research in quiet. And they honored this stipulation or request so strictly that after about 6 years up there, I felt neglected. I realized that no one knew or cared what I thought, So I started causing a little trouble to try to rectify the situation. And I made an appointment with the then new Chief Technology Officer, Craig Mundy, who had replaced Nathan, to just talk to him and explain what I was interested in, why I thought it was so great and important. Because I just wanted someone in the company to, high up in the company to say, oh yeah, that's great, you're doing the right thing. How we really value that. So, he said, well, so is this real? Do you really think a computer can be built this way? And, I said, yeah, I think, we're coming to a point technologically where these systems exist, and if we do some experiments, and then, he said, well, that seems reasonable, but then he upped the ante on me. He said, if we're going to do this, it can't just be some bunch of theorists talking to each other and chasing each other's tails and going nowhere. We should do experiments and expect to make progress and have a timeline, and we should really get this thing done. And what kind of budget would you need, and what sort of experiments? And I said, oh, wait a second, I'm just a mathematician. And he says, well, not anymore, you're not. Yeah, so we moved down here.
Because of KITP?
Well, yeah, KITP was the draw here. You're Berkeley eccentric in your view, I'm sure, but in physics, Santa Barbara is at least equal to Berkeley among the campuses, and it's because of KITP. It's really the same effect that MSRI has for math and Berkeley KITP has in physics. So we thought this would be a good place to locate the research. The funny story there is that there's always great suspicion in Redmond of anyone who has a reason to relocate to Southern California. And I told Craig that he should think of this as a research station like they have in the Antarctic, that we don't necessarily want to be there, we just have to go where the science is, however inconvenient the environment. And that's why this is called Station Q.
Q for quantum?
Q for quantum,
Sure.
yeah, and station to evoke Ice Station Zebra or something.
What is it they do that's related to you?
Yes, it's called the Kavli Institute of Theoretical Physics. It's an NSF-supported institute largely, and it's very much analogous to MSRI in math, except they have permanent faculty. So that makes it a little bit more like the way the Simon Center is projected to fill out. There are about 6 permanent faculty, and they cover all areas of physics with rotating programs. Typical program length is 3 months.
Some of the programs then are close to what you're doing, the physics that you need.
It's about perfect, being across the walkway here, the Kirby Plaza, as it's called.
That's right.
Across the Kirby Plaza from KITP, and then, when they're running a program on superconductivity or topological phases in condensed matter or exotic electronic correlations, materials with exotic electronic correlations, things like that we need that are valuable for the research we do here, then we get access to plenty of outside expertise.
What's left to do for a theoretical mathematician? Now, maybe you've become a physicist, but as a mathematician, what's left for you to do?
I think the closer you look, the more is left. In the early 2000s, Zhenghan Wang and I, with Michael Larson, wrote a paper where we proved that a large class of anionic systems has dense braid group representations. So at some level, you could say, well, that's the end of the mathematical work. Now it's the physicists and the engineers have to build the computer. Because this density result, what this says is that if you have the correct kind of quantum material, then it's excitations. These are the anyons, these point-like excitations.
What's an anyon?
Well, it's a word coined by Frank Wilczek, the MIT physicist, for a particle that's neither a boson nor a fermion. You see, bosonic statistics is symmetric and fermionic statistics is skew-symmetric. But if you exchange 2 anyons, the state of the system may change by any phase, therefore any on. Or it even may change by a matrix, and the phase may be multiplied by an operator rather than a scalar. So the word anion has kind of stuck. And the thing to think, kind of the mental picture, is that if you prepare a planar material in its ground state, in its quiescent state, it will have no excitations. And if you produce a family of isolated excitations, you can think of them as a topologist like points in the plane. And then over time, you might move these points around each other without them intersecting. And that'll define in space-time a braid, 2 plus 1 dimensional space-time. And what's known is that the topological, that the state vector of this system is moved inside the Hilbert space that describes the internal degrees of freedom, is moved according to the Jones representation. So there's a kind of a catalog of representations, and which representation is relevant depends on which quantum mechanical topological phase you've realized that your anyons are disruptions of. So once you know that braiding is dense, it means that you can approximate, and in fact efficiently approximate, any transformation of the Hilbert space by braiding. So the braiding of the anyons are sort of the gate set, if you like, in computer science lingo. So that would be a good place for mathematicians to retire from the fray. We'd say, well, it's dense, you figure out how to do it. But then you don't feel quite fair to your physics colleagues. They say, well, how do we actually make this quantum material? And then you can start thinking with them about that. A mathematician might come to it from combinatorial rules, like the form of the Jones-Wenzel projectors. But a physicist wouldn't come at it from that direction at all. They'd come at it by looking for a model Hamiltonian, such as a two-dimensional electron gas in a transverse magnetic field. So it's like two completely different languages, and there's a lot of work to try to bridge the languages and try to invent a physical system which has anticipated topological braiding properties.
And also, this mathematical version of it is sort of the limit, the perfect world.
That's right.
And this is physics, so they get up, they get fairly close to the limit, but they never get there. So then there's questions of errors adding up and approximately,
Yeah, this is a very difficult subject, but you're exactly right. So the mathematics, which could roughly be described as a modular tensor category, that gives some idealized algebraic answer to how the state should change when you braid the anyons. But the state of the system isn't really described, by this modular tensor category. That's a low energy, long wavelength approximation. So exactly as you said, the way the errors develop and according to the length scales, the general idea is that if you keep these anyons far away from each other, you're closer to the idealization. And exponentially so. The errors are something of the form e to the minus the length scale divided by some constant, which is a correlation length in the system. So how to engineer a system with short correlation lengths and long coherence times, that's one of the theoretical questions.
Mike, I know that one of your favorite papers, probably after the 81 paper, was this paper on positivity of three manifolds. What was that about?
This is an investigation. You can do it in any dimension, but it combines sort of the most elementary ideas in manifold topology and in quantum mechanics. So, in the heyday of manifold topology, you could make a name for yourself by gluing two pieces together and finding a new manifold. That's how Milnor made the exotic seven spheres. But I think the times may have passed for gluing two pieces together and finding something exciting, though maybe not in four dimensions. But the approach that my collaborators and I took on this project was to consider the superpositions of n+1 manifolds that could bound a given n manifold. And then if you glue a manifold and its n manifold and its mirror image together by the identity map, but each one is bounded by a superposition of n+1 manifolds, then you get a two-dimensional array of combining terms. So the ith contributor on the left glues up to the jth contributor on the right and forms a closed manifold. So in this way, when you glue superpositions of manifolds together, you actually get linear combinations with coefficients of closed n+1 manifolds. And this concept is actually relevant in sort of the TQFT world. It's a way of formulating a universal kind of TQFT which maps to all the specific TQFTs. And the first question you ask about this gluing process is it positive? Meaning, if you have a superposition and you glue it with its mirror image.
So by superposition, you mean a linear combination of manifolds with the same boundary?
That's right. So in a very simple case, you could say, fix the boundary, and you have manifold A, and you have manifold, say, minus B. Minus means the coefficient on that is -1. And now suppose you want to find out what's the inner product of this thing, this vector with itself. Well, you should glue it to, on the other side, A minus B. So you'll get cross terms, you'll get four terms, you'll get A glued to its orientation reverse, B glued to its orientation reverse, A, B, B, A. And the astonishing thing is that in high dimensions, it turns out that this pairing has has light-like vectors. There are vectors that when you pair them with themselves, you get 0. So it's sort of like a vector on the light cone in Lorentz geometry. And many collaborators worked on that. That was a nice piece of work. But it left the three-dimensional case open. The three-dimensional case was resolved by a paper which was finished a couple years ago with Danny Caligari and Kevin Walker. And what we discovered in this paper is that if you have a surface and you let it bound to a linear combination of three manifolds, and you glue up to get a linear combination of closed three manifolds, then the theorem is that that linear combination is never trivial if the original linear combination, if the original vector that you took was not the 0 vector. So in a sense, it says that the natural pairing on manifolds with boundary is a positive pairing in 3 dimensions, even though it has light-like vectors in high dimensions.
That sounds like it would sort of have a formal abstract proof, but in fact, it's a real tour de force to get through all the different cases.
Well, I regarded this as sort of the final exam, my personal final exam in three-manifold topology, because it actually took everything that I knew and a certain amount more, which Danny Caligari and Kevin supplied. But you really go pretty much chronologically through the history of three-manifold topology to find the spherical decomposition that Milner, the prime decomposition of three manifolds, the Waldhausen's decomposition according to Tori into simple pieces and ciphered fibered pieces, and then the Thurston geometrization theory, and then eventually you need Perlman's, some of Perlman's estimates of the behavior of Ricci flow to get some of the final conclusions. So when you string all the necessary ideas for the argument, you've pretty much swept through three-manifold topology from its inception through Perlman.
I see. So that's an interesting story.
So it's a good paper to go through for a course on three-manifold topology because nothing gets left out.